Back in the days when I was still a Blender noob, I used to go on artist session and see all of these super realistic renders, and then tell myself that I would never be like them. But time has passed and I've learned so many key points on what makes something realistic that made my renders from this to this. And I will show you all of those keys in this video, and it starts by your camera. At the end, that's why it's called photorealism. You see, real-world cameras have imperfections that make them unique. So, let me tell you about some main ones, like light glare. When you take a photo in a bright day, pointing at the sun, or maybe in a street where there are street lights, you'll see glare around light sources. And you can easily add that inside Blender or by using compositing software like After Effects. Or if you use Octane, you can just use the real-time compositor, which gives you accurate light glare. The next imperfection is lens distortion. When looking at the corner of an image, you'll see that the objects are slightly bent because of the curvature of the lens, which also causes chromatic aberration that appears in the corners and the places where there is a lot of contrast. Now, here's the thing with both of them, and that is that they need to be subtle. Stop using it like you're making a TikTok montage. Now, let's talk about depth of field. If you have messed with cameras enough, you'll know that you can't have two things be perfectly focused at the same time, because that's just an impossibility. But in 3D, it is possible. Depth of field also adds a sense of a scale. If you add too much depth of field, it would make the subject feel smaller, or the opposite. So, always make sure to turn on depth of field and have it set to the right amount. One other thing that artists been abusing the absolute fuck out of recently is adding grain to get rid of that CG look and make your renders look more natural. But what most people would do is that they would add the grain to the whole image, which is not completely accurate. Because noise and grain mostly appear in the dark parts of the image, like the shadows and corners. So, whenever you're going for extreme photorealism, always make sure to add more grain where there is less light. Speaking of light, it is really important to have the right lighting for the right scene, and HDRIs are perfect for that, because not only they give you realistic lighting, but they also give you realistic reflections. All you need to do is to look for the ones that match your environment and experiment with them. Now, here's something that a lot of people overlook. That is the careful use of reference. Whenever I see these photorealistic renders, the artists always have a big reference board from the design to the material they want to use. It would even be better to take the references yourself if you can. So, I highly suggest you to gather as many references as you can before starting something. The next key is using a texturing software. Because texturing is by far the most important step in photorealism. And there are a lot of little macro details in the real world that is really hard to replicate inside your normal 3D software. And the nice part is that you don't necessarily need to pay for Substance Painter. You can instead use Quixel Mixer, which is a free texturing tool with some great features, with one of them being having access to Quixel's big Megascan library. Now that we are talking about textures, let me introduce you to something that would change the way you approach texturing, and that is attention to detail. And now you may be like, well, that's obvious, but I don't mean to just put some texture imperfections and call it a day. What I mean is to think outside the box. I want you to give attention to the things that are so small and minute that you would think no one will even notice. And here's the thing, you want them to not notice. Because if you add that detail and they notice it, that means that it was too obvious. So add as many small details as possible, but keep them subtle. And you'll see that everyone will start asking if it's a photo or not. One little detail that I see everywhere is dust. It's literally like the secret sauce. and it's really easy to do. In summary, you want to model some really low poly shapes which will act like dust particles. And then you want to scatter them on your main objects, but keep in mind that this is really resource heavy and may affect render time. Now take a look at this image. As you can see, everything seems pretty good. Textures look realistic, lighting is on point and so on. But why it still looks off? The reason is that all of the objects have inaccurate scale. Where in this one, they all have a scale and dimensions that match the real world. That's why it's really important to not rely on your eyes and instead go and search the dimensions of the thing you want to create on Google and websites like dimensions.com. And if you're working on a specific model of something, the company would most likely mention the exact dimensions under the details tab. Another thing that people don't really talk about is that some shapes are just easier to make them look realistic. For example, let's say I'm making a render of a photorealistic doorknob, and I can choose between making the doorknob on the left or the doorknob on the right. And I probably would choose the one on the right because it is more organic and harder to replicate, comparing to the one on the left, which is almost a perfect round sphere, which makes it feel more CG. And that leads me to the next key, which is there are no 90-degree edges. Even the sharpest things, like knives, have a slight bevel to them, and that bevel will then catch the light's reflection and results in a more realistic render. Another thing that can drastically improve your render is using the ACES color management. Basically what it does is that it displays the colors the way that they would in real life. There are a lot of tutorials on how to set it up for different software and render engines, so I won't go through that in this video. But just for the ones that use cycles and Eevee, all you need to do is to go here in the render properties and scroll down till you see color management. Then just change this to filmic and you're good to go. Finally, for the last key, take your time. Make sure that you nail down every aspect from modeling to post-processing. Because if there is something that the human eye is good at, that is knowing when something is off. Now, if you want to stop having unfinished projects, go click on this video. And with that said, thanks for watching, bye, see ya.